Hello, everyone, and welcome to Slash Film Daily. Today is Tuesday, September 10th, 2024. On today's episode of the show, we're going to be talking about the latest film and TV news. My name is Ben Pearson. I'm an editor at slashfilm.com, and I'm joined on today's episode by Slash Film staff writer and box office analyst Ryan Scott.
Hey, everyone. How's it going?
Ryan, before we get into it, I just have to say congratulations. You ran your marathon this past weekend.
Oh, thanks, man. I did not expect to have this addressed on the show, but yes.
You don't have to go into like a big thing. I know we were talking yesterday on Slack, and you said that you were probably going to make a video and post it on your Instagram. So I don't want you to like launch into a whole recap of the experience or anything. But I just wanted to note this for the record for anybody who has listened to you talk about running and stuff like that on previous episodes of the podcast.
Well, yeah, no, I did. I appreciate it. I'm still sore. Today's the first day that I can kind of sort of walk normally, but yeah, I did it. So thanks, man. I really appreciate it. But yeah, had a lot of people ask, and it ended up being a bit of a kind of crazy story. So I'm going to make a video and just put it up just to answer everybody's question in one fell swoop, I guess.
Yeah.
But so I'll have that up in a couple of days once I get a chance to sit down and do it. But thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you got it, man. Congrats. That's a huge deal. Okay, so let's get into the news. Unfortunately, we have to kick things off with some sad news, which is that James Earl Jones, the iconic voice of Darth Vader and Mufasa, has died at age 93. He died yesterday. A bunch of folks were writing about this and sharing remembrances. And I just wanted to sort of open the floor to you, Ryan, to see if you had any standout James Earl Jones performances or moments that really stick with you.
I mean, look, as I've said several times on this podcast, I don't have memories that go back further than my love of Star Wars. And look, man, I'm not alone. It's Darth Vader. Like, it's not. And look, all credit to David Prowse, who was the actor on set. But if you see those videos of which you can find in the making of Star Wars and stuff, that like of David Prowse on set without the James Earl Jones voiceover, it's a different character. It doesn't work. You know, and then, but I mean, even going back to, when I had, I believe it was the VHS of Jurassic Park was the first time they had that making of Jurassic Park special that James Earl Jones narrated. And Jurassic Park is my favorite movie of all time. So you best believe I watched that when I was a kid, and I've watched it a bunch of times since. Like, so even going to that, you have, and then of course, Mufasa, but then you even have stuff like people of my generation, like The Sandlot was a very important, informative movie.
Yeah,
and,
me too.
So it's like, I mean, he's one of those guys that like, who doesn't have, you know what I mean? Like, it's just, he's just in all of our DNA. He's one of those guys. So
yeah.
The only thing I'll say though, he's 93. Like, we all got to go sometime. If the goalposts are anywhere for a life well lived, I mean, this is exactly what it is. Like, so to me, I choose, like, I take moments like this where I'm like, that it feels like worth celebrating what life can be rather than mourning the passing, if that makes any sense. Like, this is one of those times where that's the feeling I'm left with.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, James Earl Jones was, I think he technically won an EGOT. I think his Oscar was some sort of honorary Academy Award or something that he received later in life. But I think he's one of the very small group of folks who have won an EGOT. And I know that he was like a towering stage performer. I never had the chance to see him on stage or anything, but in the wake of his passing, I've seen a lot of folks share clips from stage performances. Like, he was in Fences, the August Wilson play that Denzel Washington starred in and directed as a movie back in 2016. And that performance just looks incredible. I wanted to give a couple of quick shout outs to some of his other movie performances. He played Admiral Greer in The Hunt for Red October, Patriot Games, and Clear and Present Danger. He was like one of the few through lines while the Jack Ryan character changed over between Alec Baldwin and Harrison Ford in the 90s in those movies. Of course, he appeared in Conan the Barbarian. He was actually in Doctor Strangelove, which I'd totally forgotten or didn't realize at the time when I first saw that movie. I recently caught up with a baseball film from 1976 called The Bingo Long Traveling All-Stars and Motor Kings, and he is fantastic in that. So, ridiculous title for a movie, but if you've not seen that and you're looking for like a great sort of undersung James Earl Jones performance, definitely seek that one out. My personal favorite performance of his, though, was as the reclusive author Terrence Mann in Field of Dreams. The scene in that movie,
yes,
where he talks about the power of baseball is, I was trying to think about this. I think it's my platonic ideal of the concept of Americana in my head. Like, just the speech that he gives and the way that that's filmed and the light and everything and the cornfield and all of that. is like it captures something primal that I can't quite put my finger on. But
I don't
yeah,
even love baseball, but that's one of those speeches that like makes you feel like you've always loved it, like even though
yep.
you don't. Like it's great because I yeah, it's like that speech in Independence Day where suddenly like you're the most patriotic person that's ever lived. Just it's like it really is that. It's one of the all-time greats, and that is a complete credit to him.
Yes, incredible actor James Earl Jones. Rest in peace. And yeah, I just wanted to pay tribute to him at the top of the show here. So, all right, we didn't have a traditional episode yesterday, Ryan. So why don't we go over some box office results from this past weekend? Beetlejuice was probably the big story, but I actually haven't looked at the charts or the numbers or anything like that. So why don't you run through the top 10 at the box office for me?
Yeah, we definitely got some stuff to talk about, but as you mentioned, so what we're going to talk about today, since we're doing this on Tuesday every once in a while, we're going over the actual numbers, not the estimates, which is what we usually end up going over on Monday. So the actual numbers for the weekend came in, and so yeah, Tim Burton's Beetlejuice, 36 years in the making, debuted with $111 million domestically, the third biggest opening weekend of the year, I believe, behind Inside Out 2 and Deadpool and Wolverine. And yeah, just an absolute monster here. And it made $36.2 million internationally, so $147 million global start. Worth remembering that the original Beetlejuice played almost exclusively in North America back in 1988. I'm sure it was released overseas, but that was before like we were tracking overseas box office very well, at least religiously or whatever. So this was very much like an American movie that has garnered a reputation overseas in the years since its original release. So it was probably never going to be as big overseas, but at this point you're talking about a movie with $100 million budget that has made 147 worldwide, almost double what the original made during its entire theatrical run.
Wow.
Unadjusted for inflation, of course, but so yeah, I mean, this is immediately a hit for Warner Brothers. It, even with the lackluster, at least compared to North American grosses, like overseas performance, it should easily get to 400 worldwide by the time all said and done. I don't want to, project out too far, but a hundred million budget with a $400 million gross and all of the merchandising opportunity and everything else that would come with it. Any studio will take that any day.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a big deal. Great start. There's actually not a lot to say about it other than like, because it would be one of those things where we'd be shocked about the, how well it opened, but the projections kept going up so much in the lead up that it kind of became the expectation that it was going to do north of 100. So,
Mhm.
but again, that is still shocking. Like, let's be clear. It's by far the biggest Tim Burton open in a very long time. It's another example of Warner Brothers capitalizing in this early September window that is often ignored. It remains the highest grossing September weekend of all time with 123 million. This is now number 2, followed by It Chapter 2 with 91 million, all like first third of September openings.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, this should not be considered a given. I remember earlier this year, even I was like, I don't know about this because it seemed like we were at that point in the sort of rise and fall of the movie cycle that happens sometimes, where we were coming off of like the disappointment of, or the relative disappointment of Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning and Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, and there was this sense in Hollywood, or at least among folks like us, that like maybe audiences are finally ready to fully embrace, or maybe not fully, but more eagerly embrace brand new stories and exciting things instead of just rehashed IP. And because this project was so, or this IP was so old, yes, you had Jenna Ortega, but there was no guarantee that people were going to be as interested in Beetlejuice 36 years later as they seem to have been. So,
Right.
congrats to all the folks involved, and they definitely seemed to know what they were doing on this one.
Well, and I will say though, this is something I haven't talked about as much lately because fortunately it hasn't been as much of a problem. But I think one of the things that you pointed out is just one of the reasons I complain about this so often is that Beetlejuice had $100 million budget. Is that an expensive movie? Yes. Is it crazy expensive relative to what they were making? No. Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning, I have all sympathies because that movie had to contend with the pandemic and everything. But at the end of the day, that budget ballooned to, I believe, close to 300 million. Yes, Paramount got 75 million of that back, I think, from some sort of insurance lawsuit, but still north of 200 million. And I forgot the other one Indiana Jones and Dial of Destiny, almost $300 million budget. So those movies, if they had $100 million budget, would have been more than fine.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that they necessarily could have been made for that much, but I'm saying that, this is where the relativity of that budget is incredibly important. Because if
Mhm.
this was a $200 million movie, we'd be talking about it very differently. Even if it was a $150 million movie, we'd be talking about it, pretty differently. So that is very important. And I think that it's good that, Burton and Warner Brothers managed to get this in for that number. But
Yeah.
so I guess should we go through the rest of the top 10 here?
Definitely.
Okay, so coming in at number 2 was Deadpool and Wolverine in its 7th weekend, but still pulled in another $7 million, dropped about 54%. Number 3 was Reagan, which actually is doing very well, with $4.8 million in its second weekend. Actually added 16 screens, dropped less than 37%. Number 4, Alien Romulus, which is one we're going to talk about more here in a second, did $3.9 million in its fourth weekend, hanging on pretty well, even though it lost 560 screens, dropped about 57%. Number 5, It Ends With Us, with another $3.7 million, dropped a little less than 50% this weekend. Arguably the most profitable movie of the year. We can talk about that more in a second as well. Number 7 is The Forge, with another $3 million, kind of becoming a little sleeper hit here, dropped just 35%. At almost 21 million domestic there, for a movie that with a $5 million budget, I believe. Number 7, we had Twisters, finally kind of falling off a cliff here. $2.1 million in its 8th weekend, dropped 72%. But the previous weekend, it got a bunch of 40x screens back over Labor Day, so that 72% drop is a little deceptive. The movie has done very well for itself domestically. At number 8, we have Blink Twice, with another $2 million in its third weekend, dropped 57%. Still, though, it passed the $20 million mark domestically, so should do well enough for Amazon in the end here. Number 9, we have Despicable Me 4, with another $1.8 million domestically. But the bigger thing here is that Despicable Me 4 has made $931 million worldwide. It caught up overseas. For a while, it was trailing overseas. It has now just caught on overseas. So, I mean, it is just a monster hit. And then the other big one this weekend that didn't get talked about a lot, The Front Room, the latest from A24, debuted with just $1.6 million in 2,095 screens for a $794 per screen average. And we've talked a lot about those per screen averages here in recent weeks. That is lousy. Just to give you an example, Beetlejuice had 24,000 per screen. So now that is at the high end, I will admit. But even Deadpool and Wolverine in its 7th weekend did just over 2,000 per screen. So The Front Room, that is the debut feature from the Eggers brothers, related to Robert Eggers of The Lighthouse and The Witch fame. Yeah, I don't want to drone on too much about that one, but that's a rough debut, and it's rotten on Rotten Tomatoes, both the critic and audience score. I didn't see what the cinema score was, but there's no reason to believe that one's going to recover in the coming weeks. So
Yeah.
kind of a bit of a yikes there. But anyway, so that's the top 10 for you this week. Anything stick out to you that you want to talk about?
Well, you mentioned Romulus and It Ends With Us, and I was curious what additions you had on those fronts.
Yeah, so let's talk about that real quick. So Alien Romulus is now the highest grossing horror movie of the year by a considerable margin. It has made $314 million worldwide, almost $100 million of that coming from China. And if you've listened to me talk on this podcast in the last couple of years, Hollywood movies have not typically done well in China in the pandemic era. This is an outlier in a big bad way. But this movie had an $80 million budget, and it is, in a couple of days, will have made 4 times that budget. And this movie was originally supposed to go directly to Hulu. It is now the 10th biggest movie of the year worldwide overall. So, I'm guessing Disney's going to take a lesson there as far as future direct-to-streaming releases are concerned.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that's a big one. And then It Ends With Us, though, is right on its tail, $309 million worldwide against a $25 million budget. Now, you can calculate this a number of ways, but I believe that at the end of the day, It Ends With Us is going to end up as the most profitable movie of the year, in terms of like investment and return on investment goes. You got stuff like Late Night with the Devil that was very cheap, that made, so you could maybe make arguments there. But I think in terms of just sheer quantity of cash, I want to give all due respect to It Ends With Us for doing what it's done, because it is just incredible stuff that's pulled off. So that's pretty much it. But yeah, those are worth sort of ruminating on for at least a second here.
Yeah, definitely. The only other thing that I wanted to mention that I don't think was in the top 10 was yesterday I got a press release from Leica that said that the 15th anniversary of Coraline has passed $51 million dollars at the global box office since its theatrical re-release on August 15th. So you and I talked about that a bunch whenever that was, last week or the week before. So we don't need to like rehash that again, but just the fact that they're sending out press releases saying like, hey, this did really well. I mean, like sometimes
Well,
studios will send out press releases and you just kind of like roll your eyes, but this is one of those instances where I feel like 15 years later, the fact that they made more than $50 million dollars at the box office actually is pretty impressive and probably is warranted. A press release
yeah.
is warranted.
Well, let's just provide just a slight bit of context for somebody that hasn't been listening. So, Coraline, in its original run, made $75.2 million domestic and $49.3 million internationally for a $124.5 million worldwide cum. It has made $51 million in this re-release, so it's made almost half of its original total again. So, like, if you take all of the and it's done really well in its other re-releases. So, a movie that originally made $124 million 15 years ago has now made $184 million worldwide, all told, which is crazy. So, that is kind of one of the cooler box office stories of the year, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I think that'll do it for the box office talk. I did want to mention that you wrote an article called Five Reasons Why Beetlejuice Killed It at the Box Office that I will link to in the show notes. So if people want to do sort of a deeper assessment of that movie's success at the box office, you can do that by clicking the story in the show notes. All right, let's take a break and then we'll come back and get into a few news items here. All right, so the biggest one I think that we should probably talk about first, Ryan, is Tom Holland's Spider-Man 4 has a director. First of all, it was news to me that this movie is even happening, let alone was looking for a director. I think I'd heard some rumors or some rumbling that like Sam Raimi might come back to direct this movie, and I never know how much credence to put into stuff like that. I think as of I don't know, the last time I tapped in on this and was paying attention, Tom Holland was just saying stuff in the press like, yeah, we kind of want to do it, but we want to make sure that it's worth doing, that we come back for the right reasons, and that there's a legit story reason for doing it, blah, 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 that kind of thing. And now this announcement came out, I think this was very recently, that this movie has a director. So tell me about that.
Yeah, so you're not wrong in that like it had not been fully confirmed by Sony, Marvel Studios that Spider-Man 4 was happening, but obviously when you look at Spider-Man No Way Home making $1.9 billion worldwide, this movie was always going to happen. But Tom Holland is not contractually obligated to be in this movie, nor is Zendaya. Now, my understanding is that their contracts are being worked out right now, but anyway, so what we learned yesterday is that Destin Daniel Cretton, best known as the director of Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, is going to be the director. John Watts directed all three of Tom Holland's previous solo movies, so he has since moved on. He's got Wolves coming out, the movie that stars George Clooney and Brad Pitt, and doing other things. He was going to do Fantastic Four, ended up working on that Skeleton Crew Star Wars show. Anyway, so there's a lot to go over here. On the one hand, it means that Spider-Man's happening, and it seems like it's happening quickly. It looks like they're going to try to shoot as early as early next year, which would probably put it release sometime summer 2026. Mm-hmm. Eric McKenna and Chris Summers, I believe, are their names. That they wrote the previous three movies. They're coming back. But the one thing that is important here is that Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings 2 is supposed to happen. And Destin Daniel Cretton was supposed to direct that movie. Well, Shang-Chi came out 3 years ago already, and it seems like this is going to be his next project. And so unless Marvel wants to let someone else direct Shang-Chi 2, that seems to have been put on the back burner. That to me is the most fascinating part of this whole thing. Because we don't have any story details about Spider-Man 4 yet. We don't know anything other than this is the guy directing it. There are lots of rumors out there. You can read all the rumors you want. As far as what has been firmed up, we do not know. So that's kind of where it stands.
I think it's also worth noting that Destin Daniel Cretton, this director we're talking about, was previously either attached or mentioned to direct Avengers: The Kang Dynasty, which then morphed into Avengers: Doomsday, which has Robert Downey Jr. on board. So I was wondering if the inclusion of Downey and the pivot toward the Fantastic Four and all that kind of stuff, if you think that maybe that changed Marvel's grander plan for a potential Shang-Chi sequel, like maybe that character was going to get his own movie and then now they're just going to roll him into another Avengers movie or something like that and like let this storyline play out before they continue to invest in solo stories for that character. I don't know. I mean, it's pure speculation on my part. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
I would think that might be right. Like, because I think there was a rumor back when it was going to be the Kang Dynasty that, Shang-Chi was going to be a big part of that movie, which would make sense because Destin Daniel Cretton was going to direct that movie at one point. The one thing I will say, though, is that Shang-Chi was the one potential new franchise that they've earned in the post-Endgame era. I would have thought you would want to invest in that, like, quicker. Does that make sense? Like where you'd want to double down on the success you had. Look, I don't know there. Simu Liu seems to be a likable enough star. He was in Barbie as well. So I don't know. All I know is Marvel seems to like Destin Daniel Cretton, and he's a great director. So says I for whatever that's worth. So, like I personally like the idea of him directing a Spider-Man movie. I think that bodes well for the action in that movie, but it is interesting relative to the would-be franchise that is probably now going to have to wait till after like Secret Wars. So I don't know. That's kind of, it's interesting. But
yeah, and the last thing I'll say on this subject is somebody shared a rumor in our Slack channel. Again, we're not sure how much credence to put into this, but there was some sort of rumor going around about how the spell that Doctor Strange put on the Spider-Man character in whatever movie that was it Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of... No, it was Spider-Man No Way Home, right?
No Way Home.
Yeah, so that spell could be broken for whatever this new Spider-Man project is. And Jacob was saying like, well, that doesn't really make a lot of sense because it seemed like the way that No Way Home ended was sort of teeing up what we all traditionally think of as a standard comic book Spider-Man story, like finally putting that character in a scenario where he's on his own and broke and, like the sort of the classic Peter Parker type of take and spin on that character. So if the spell is just undone, then maybe that could remove some of the context that we assumed this movie would be moving into. But again, just a rumor, just some stuff that that's floating around in the ether, things to talk about. So we'll see what approach they actually take because we don't have any details about what is actually going to be happening in Spider-Man 4, who the villains are, anything like that. So stay tuned for more. I'm sure we'll be talking about that later. Okay, so I wanted to mention briefly this Lord of the Rings story. There is Ian McKellen, I guess, went on a talk show and really dropped a bombshell about the Lord of the Rings, The Hunt for Gollum, which is the new movie that Andy Serkis is directing. It is supposed to be, according to early reports, about Aragorn and Gandalf teaming up to track Gollum and find him and maybe try to like learn information about where the One Ring is and learn about the rise of Sauron, stuff like that. It's kind of like an in-between quel. We've talked a little bit about that on the podcast before, but Ian McKellen went on a UK morning show and he said, all I know is they called me up and they said these films were going to happen, that they're mainly going to be about Gollum. Andy Serkis, who played Gollum, is going to direct, and there will be a script arriving sometime in the new year, and then I will judge whether I want to go back. I'm told it's 2 films. I probably shouldn't be saying this, but I haven't read the script, and I don't know when it is. I don't even know where it will be filmed. So that was his quote, and obviously the 2 films thing is new information for anybody who's been paying attention. Kind of a terrible decision, I think, because it sounds like a pretty slimmed down story as it is, at least for what little information we know about it from the outside looking in. This franchise with the Hobbit movies already has a pretty gnarly history of stretching things out beyond their limits. So the notion just on paper of the Lord of the Rings, The Hunt for Gollum becoming 2 movies seems like a disaster in the making, honestly. But I don't know. We'll see. I'm trying to be positive about this. I love the Lord of the Rings. I love that world. I despise the Hobbit movies, except for some of the casting in there. But yeah, I'm very curious to see what happens here. I want to believe in Andy Serkis. I know he cares a lot about that character of Gollum. And I know he can be a pretty decent director when he is given the right material. So I don't know. I know you're not like a big Lord of the Rings guy, Ryan. So I don't know if you
Oh
have
no,
any.
I love the Lord of the Rings movies. Like I'm just not a big like I don't go deep into the world, but I love those movies, and I don't hate the Hobbit movies as much as other people do, but I do feel like the biggest sin those movies committed was stretching the material too thin,
Mm,
and that seems like a concern here. And I have
yeah.
that same concern of like what look, this is just something Ian McKellen might have been in on a conversation. Who knows? But if it really is going to be two movies, that does feel like, that's a bit of a concern. But
Yeah,
I don't have
it's
a lot more to
certainly.
add. But yeah,
Yeah, I don't really either. I just know that David Zaslav, who runs Warner Brothers Discovery, and that company is responsible for putting out these new Lord of the Rings movies, had made it very, very clear, I think a year or two ago, that he wanted to sort of open the floodgates when it comes to Lord of the Rings content, as it were. And Warner Brothers has nothing to do with the Lord of the Rings show that's on Amazon Prime Video right now. So I guess what I'm saying is I would not be surprised under David Zaslav if the decision was made to split this into two films, because it just seems like the sort of uh, money grubbing decision that you would expect from somebody like him. So anyway, final story of today's show. Rogue One's Peter Cushing CGI resurrection sparked a Star Wars lawsuit 8 years later. So in 2016, Peter Cushing, who was long dead, appeared in CGI form, a digital recreation of him in, Rogue One, a Star Wars story. And now a lawsuit is being filed about that. Tell me, Ryan, what's going on here?
I should say before I get into this, I am not a lawyer. I did. This is a little complicated. It seems like so. I don't know all of the ins and outs. I'm going to do the best to explain to you what's going on as I understand it. That all having been said, uh, yes, Peter Cushing, who played Grand Moff Tarkin in the original Star Wars: A New Hope, was digitally recreated for Rogue One using an actor who did motion capture on set, and then they sort of did a bunch of fancy CGI to recreate Tarkin. With depending on who you talk to, mixed results, right? Like whether or not that was worth doing, I don't know. So now what's happened is a producer by the name of Kevin Francis and his company Tyburn Film Productions is pursuing legal action for that recreation of Cushing's likeness in Rogue One. Um, and basically what happened is Disney owns this company Lunac Heavy Industries, which is the company that I guess was the one that was primarily responsible for doing this CGI. Well, Disney had gained permission from Cushing's estate to do this. Yet Tyburn claims that they entered into an agreement with Cushing before his death, and that agreement prevented the reproduction of his appearance without consent. So it seems like the reason this lawsuit is happening all these years later is that it's kind of been bubbling up behind the scenes, and the gears of justice turn slowly. So now a UK High Court has denied Disney's request to have this totally thrown out. And a judge by the name of Tom Mitchison ruled that he was not persuaded that Tyburn will win the case, but he added that he's not persuaded that the case is unarguable to the standard required to give summary judgment or to strike it out, meaning that it's got to play out. So I don't know for sure what it looks like. This will likely then go to trial unless Disney can somehow settle it out of court. Is kind of what it looks like is going to happen here. But that's the ins and outs of it as best as I understand it.
Okay, so I'm learning all this for the first time. I had not read this story before talking to you. I was kind of hoping, Ryan, I have to admit, naively so, that this could be an instance where this lawsuit was being filed and maybe it would cause Disney and other studios to think twice about using digital recreations of characters in the future. From what it sounds like, this is kind of like a one-off instance where there may have been a weird deal made with this production company because Disney if they got consent from the Cushing estate, but then didn't get consent from Tyburn Film Productions, that's where it seems like the lawsuit is coming into play. So it seems to me like for future instances anyway of this type of thing happening, as long as the correct contracts are signed and people get permission in the right ways and stuff like that, this is still probably going to keep happening.
Well, I think it's still going to keep happening, but I think what it says is that Disney kind of tried to go about it the right way, and it still led to problems. So I think on the one hand, yeah, like these digital recreations and AI and all these things are still going to permeate films and attempt to resurrect the dead, as it were. But I think what this shows is that it's going to lead to legal problems, we're kind of in the wild west of all this right now. So until there starts like legal precedents start being set, or like governments step in to sort of put rulings and how these things can be dealt with, it's going to continue to be a bit of a tangled mess. Like we talked about James Earl Jones earlier in the show. Well, he stopped voicing Darth Vader a few years ago, but he gave permission to have his voice used and recreated to let Darth Vader live on, essentially, as is my understanding. So that was something that was like, okay, I'm giving explicit permission for this thing to happen. And another thing that I've heard is that other actors now that are kind of aging out, like I don't know for sure if this is something that he's addressed, but look at a guy like Robert De Niro, who's in his 80s. Well, does he now, in like his will, have to be like, don't recreate me with like, because these are things now these older actors have to consider, which is crazy. So the ones that don't, that's where it's going to get messy. So I do think that, yes, this is an odd situation, but it does indicate to me that more issues are going to come up. That's where I sort of land on it.
Yeah. And this is not a new thing. I mean, there was that commercial of Fred Astaire dancing with a vacuum cleaner, I think it was, like many, many years ago. And then Robin Williams famously had a bunch of stuff in his will about his likeness not being able to be used for a certain number of time, I think it is, after his death. So this is stuff that like A-list actors have been thinking about for a long time. But yes, as you say, I think especially with the rise of generative AI and all the conversations that we've been having about that over the past couple of years, I would say every actor, anybody who's been in a studio project or even been an extra in stuff. I remember there being a big controversy about some of the extras and background actors who were on stuff like WandaVision being essentially forced into having their digital likeness created on, maybe against their will or whatever, if they wanted to keep their job, all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, all of these conversations are sort of swirling in a big way. And if nothing else, I think this will maybe just be another reminder for people to try to get the protections that they need if that's something that they're interested in, or get the financial reimbursements that they need locked in place and as ironclad as possible in their contracts and wills and all that stuff. So we'll keep an eye on how this goes. If there's any significant updates, we'll come back and let you know on a future episode of the podcast. But just a fascinating snapshot in time, I think, for where we are right now.
Agreed.
I think that's going to do it for today's episode of the show. You can find more about all of the stories that we mentioned on today's show at slashfilm.com and linked inside the show notes for the episode. Slash Film Daily is published every weekday, bringing the most exciting news from the world of movies and TV, as well as deeper dives into the great features you can find on the site. You can subscribe to the show on Apple, Overcast, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Send your feedback, questions, comments, concerns, and mailbag topics to us at bpearson@slashfilm.com. Make sure to leave your name and general geographic location in case we mention your email on the air. Don't forget to take a minute to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That really helps us out a lot. Tell your friends about the show any way you can. Thank you so much for listening. And